I am delighted tonight to have been asked to introduce Dr. Prakash, who was actually I met in 2009 when I first taught an epigraphy course at the Institute of Fine Arts, and she stuck in my mind at first because amongst all the students, she was the only one who was interested in hieroglyphs too. She was interested in the art, she was also interested in the hieroglyphs. And then she completely justified my faith in that as an indicator of superior intellect, when she decided to do her thesis on the Old Kingdom, which is obviously the right period. She is a graduate of Tulane University. She graduated in 2007 with a very trendy topic that you haven't done much with since, I think, on Aegean and Egyptian interconnections. While she was at the IFA, she worked as a TA for 3 different courses, including mine. She did a superb job, and the students loved her. I'm sure that's true of the others. And of the 6 semesters of a survey course that she taught independently at City College of New York, which Rima has inherited and is now teaching. So she has quite a background, and she had quite a background when she graduated from the Institute of Fine Arts in 2017 with a dissertation on depictions of the foreign other Old Kingdom prisoner statues under the advice of Dr. David O'Connor and secondarily it's unusual when you finish your PhD to immediately get a really good job. Tara got one. She filled in for a year for Betsy Bryan at the Johns Hopkins University as a postdoctoral research fellow in Egyptology, where she taught several courses as well as doing research. And most recently, she has undertaken a fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she is currently Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Egyptian Art. And I wanted to stress that she's done this thing on the Aegeans and the Egyptians, and then she did this dissertation on foreigners and the representation of foreigners in these Old Kingdom statues. But she's got all sorts of other interests. Some of them grew out of the interest in foreigners, like the interest in iconoclasm and the destruction of art, a very interesting topic. Ethnicity and identity in ancient Egypt, foreign interconnections for obvious reasons, the manipulation of texts and of imagery, and then a bit of a step from there. She's moved logically, but in a major way, towards pain. Obviously, foreigners are associated with pain in ancient Egypt, and she's worked on pain and the depiction of emotion, as well as other things like performity and ritual. So she's got lots of things that she's got irons in the fire and all sorts of directions she can go to do a lot of interesting scholarship. Tonight she is going to talk to us about foreigners, I think pain as well. Yeah, a little bit. No, not okay. Despicable. Next time. Pain another time. She's holding it back, so she'll be asked again. Another theater or another lecture. She, by the way, has a very long view for somebody who's only been at grad school for a year. She's talking on despicable kings and debased rivals, the enemies of Ramses II in the Battle of Kadesh.
Thank you, Anne, so much for that very lovely introduction. I don't mean to disappoint you, but this won't be about the Old Kingdom either, or pain, so hopefully that's okay with everyone. And thank you so much to Stephanie and the ARCE New York chapter for having me here and organizing this and giving me this opportunity to share my work with you. During his reign in the 19th dynasty, Ramses II courageously fought and defeated the Hittite Empire and its allies in order to take the city of Kadesh. Egypt had controlled Kadesh and its neighboring state of Amurru in modern-day Syria since the reign of Thutmose III, who greatly extended Egypt's authority in the Levant. However, later in the 18th dynasty, the Hittites, who lived to the north in Anatolia, conquered the region. While Ramses' predecessor, Seti I, briefly retook the city, at some point before the 5th regnal year of Ramses II, Kadesh had returned to Hittite control. In order to recapture the city, which was located on the Orontes River, Ramses led his army north in 4 divisions. As the king and his division reached the nearby town of Shabtuna, they encountered 2 Shasu tribesmen. These men declared the allegiance of their tribes and chiefs with Egypt over the Hittites, and told the pharaoh that the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, and his army were not preparing to fight the Egyptians in Kadesh, as Ramses had expected, but had fled north to the city of Aleppo. Therefore, Ramses and his division excitedly hurried on to Kadesh without waiting for the rest of his army. After the Egyptians had arrived northwest of the city and started to set camp, 2 Hittite scouts were captured. The Egyptians beat them and forced them to reveal that Muwatalli had tricked Ramses and that the Hittite forces and their allies were actually hidden and ready to strike on the other side of the city. Almost simultaneously, the enemy chariots attacked. Ramses responded by rushing into the hordes of enemies to fight. His army became too afraid, and they abandoned Ramses on the battlefield to contend with the enemy alone. But with the support of his divine father Amun, Ramses managed to lead 6 charges against the Hittite coalition by himself. Finally, Egyptian allies from the coast of Amurru arrived and joined the pharaoh's resistance. Eventually, the Hittite coalition drew back, leaving Ramses alive and triumphant. Now, it certainly is a heroic and dramatic story. But to some degree, it appears to have been only that, namely a story. In actuality, the second day of fighting and the overall battle seems to have ended in a stalemate. Indeed, in their own records, the Hittites also claimed that they had won. Moreover, once Ramses and his army returned home, the Hittites immediately took back control of Kadesh. Yet Ramses chose to commemorate and highlight this battle, ordering reliefs and textual accounts of it to be carved on many temple walls throughout Egypt. In doing this, Ramses was clearly less interested in recording history accurately than in constructing and promulgating a propagandistic and exaggerated version of the events, which uniquely emphasized the pharaoh's personal valor and his sole ability to defeat Egypt's enemies. Therefore, although the reliefs refer to an actual event, their primary purpose was closely tied to the Egyptian belief system. Similarly, the depiction of Ramses' foreign foes in these reliefs are imbued with ideological underpinnings. The Egyptians deliberately manipulated this imagery in order to better convey particular beliefs about foreigners. At the same time, this desire to express ideology coexisted and worked in tangent with the need to communicate some degree of reality concerning the actual events that occurred at Kadesh and the foreigners' roles in them. So today I'd like to explore this tension between ideology and actuality by considering 3 different types of enemies in the Kadesh reliefs. First, I will discuss the Hittite coalition, who surround the pharaoh in their chariots, yet never pose any actual threat to him. While Egyptian texts describe the coalition as having been comprised of many different ethnic groups who allied with the Hittites, the artists consistently depicted only 3 different types of foreigners. This seems to reflect the Egyptian tendency to artistically condense foreigners into particular categories with stereotypical features, even when an acknowledgement of the diversity of Egypt's foreign neighbors is provided textually. Indeed, the Egyptians' primary concern here seems to have been to convey the multiplicity of the enemy chariot forces. Then I will turn to one particular foe, the ruler of Aleppo, who sided with the Hittites. This small detail in the enormous and complex Kadesh reliefs not only reflects an attempt at humor on the part of the Egyptian artists, but it is also a subtle reference to the way in which rebellious foreigners were aligned with enemies of Osiris and the sun god, according to Egyptian ideology. Finally, I will focus on the representation of the Hittite king himself. As a powerful foreign leader, the Hittite king posed particular problems for the Egyptian artists. While he needed to be recognizable as a ruler and the primary opponent of Ramses, his highly negative status as a foreign rebel also had to be clear. Thus, one finds that the Egyptian artist set him apart from the mass of foreigners in certain ways, while also manipulating his image to thoroughly malign and denigrate him. Overall, by considering the depiction of the Hittite coalition, the ruler of Aleppo, and the Hittite king, the ingenuity of the Egyptian artists and their ability to express a rich array of beliefs and truths through imagery becomes clear. One also develops a better understanding of the Egyptian attitude towards foreigners during the late New Kingdom. Now, before I begin my analysis of the Kadesh reliefs, I'd like to briefly consider the role of foreigners in Egyptian art in general. Antonio Lopriano first introduced the concept of topos and mimesis for descriptions of foreigners within ancient Egyptian literature, and multiple scholars have demonstrated that this same distinction applies to Egyptian art as well. Mimetic treatments, like the stela on the left, are more realistic portrayals that treat foreigners as individuals, often allowing for positive characteristics rather than simply as stereotypes. On the other hand, the foreigner topos reflects the state ideology, which understood foreigners as evil and dangerous creatures that were symbols of negative and chaotic forces. They posed a constant threat to the stability of Egypt and the entire cosmos. It was the duty of the Egyptian pharaoh to annihilate and control this threat, thus maintaining order. This was one of the king's most fundamental and crucial responsibilities. From this perspective, foreigners were stereotypes, usually depicted as defeated and subjugated captives, or in the process of being violently massacred by the Egyptian king. Yet rather than being a strictly binary model, topos and mimesis actually coexist in any representation of foreigners. Thus, in this stela, the Asiatic is still depicted with stereotypical Asiatic features. On the other hand, the Egyptian smiting scene, like that on the right, despite being a highly charged ideological topos, could be manipulated to reflect reality. So here, the names of numerous specific foreign countries surround the scene. Similarly, the Kadesh reliefs fit into the larger pictorial category of so-called battle scenes, which were often carved on exterior temple walls. Perhaps more properly described as slaughter scenes, these scenes depict the foreigner topos, highlighting the valor and ferocity of the Egyptian pharaoh as he slays and defeats his foreign enemies. The outcome of these scenes is always assured. The Egyptian king, and by extension Egypt, will dominate and destroy all who dare to oppose him. Yet the Battle of Kadesh, like many of the battle scenes, was an actual historical event, not simply a stereotypical topos. Thus, topos and mimesis are very much at play in these scenes, as we will see. So one can generally divide the Kadesh material into three categories. The first includes the large-scale reliefs, which have captions included throughout them. These reliefs will be the focus of my talk this evening. The second category of evidence is the so-called poem, which is more accurately known as the literary record. It is a long, highly rhetorical textual account of the battle that was carved nearby or adjacent to the reliefs. And the third category of evidence is known as the bulletin, which is a shorter textual account that is usually found within the pictorial reliefs. The Kadesh reliefs were carved onto walls of 3 temples in Thebes, namely the temples of Karnak, Luxor, and Ramses' mortuary temple, the Ramesseum. Ramses also ordered it carved onto 2 other temples that he had constructed, the Great Temple at Abu Simbel and his temple at Abydos. Within most of these reliefs, 2 different scenes can be identified. The Egyptian camp just prior to and at the beginning of the battle, and the battle itself, which I will refer to as the battle scene. It is this scene that I will primarily be discussing this evening. All of the reliefs follow the same overall format and contain many of the same narrative references. So, for example, Ramses is always the largest figure. In the battle scenes, he charges towards Kadesh and the Hittite king in his chariot, and in the camp scenes, he sits enthroned and is informed of the Hittite king's trick, while the captured Hittites are beaten. However, the way that the details were depicted in each relief could vary in telling ways, as I will show. Indeed, the repetition of the reliefs enables one to compare and contrast them, giving a window into the way artists were able to manipulate standard imagery in order to convey different meanings. In all of the reliefs, there are largely three figure types that the Egyptians employed for the foreign enemy. A clean-shaven face, high forehead, and fairly delicate features distinguishes the first type. The second type has relatively full, yet pointed beards, bulbous-like heads, and somewhat heavier facial features. And the third type is recognizable by what appears to be a shaved head with a tassel or lock emerging. It's also possible that this is a type of helmet. Indeed, throughout the relief, some of the foreigners do seem to be wearing helmets while others are not. But any variations are minute, and these three foreigner types are immediately recognizable in all of the reliefs. The majority of the enemies were depicted with type 1 features. This includes the Hittite king himself, who is labeled with the caption. Thus, type 1 would seem to be Hittites. With their full beards, type 2 most closely resemble the Egyptian stereotypical representation of Syrians. Type 3 is a bit more ambiguous, but I agree with Anthony Spollinger's identification of these men as a group of Anatolians. However, there are inconsistencies with the use of these types if we accept that they represent Hittites, Syrians, and Anatolians. So, for example, the ruler of Aleppo, who I will discuss in further detail a bit later, is depicted as a Hittite, even though Aleppo was a Syrian city just north of Kadesh. This would seem to give the impression that the actual ethnicity of the foreigners was less important than simply depicting multiple types of foreigners. Moreover, it is repeatedly stated within the textual sources that the enemy troops actually consisted of numerous foreign peoples allied together. In the literary record, there are 4 references to this coalition, while in the bulletin there is 1. Each list differs, with some being more abbreviated than others, but all of them are far more specific than what the reliefs depict. Indeed, the longest list, which is on the left here, includes 17 foreign countries. Even the list that only mentioned those foreign countries who specifically comprise the enemy chariot forces, which are in the middle and on the right here, still name 4 and 8 countries respectively. In art, the Egyptians tended to depict foreigners as belonging to particular broad ethnic groups that were each consistently given the same stereotypical features. So here you can see a scene from the tomb of Seti I, showing typical Nubians, Libyans, and Asiatics, the 3 neighbors with which the Egyptians interacted consistently throughout their entire history. But these stereotypical types were not reflective of reality. Textual records, as well as occasional imagery, demonstrate that the Egyptians realized that these broad categorizations actually encompassed many more specific ethnic groups. For example, the Egyptians recognized that not all people from the Levant who were visually grouped together as Asiatics were actually the same. Yet artistically, they condensed this diversity into recognizable broad stereotypes. This seems to be what is occurring in the Kadesh reliefs. There was little interest in representing exactly which foreign countries had aligned against Ramses. Instead, the artist condensed these many countries into 3 different foreign types. Not all of the countries listed in the textual records are known or can be situated on a map, but for those that can, it is clear that the Hittite coalition included ethnic and cultural groups from across Anatolia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Certainly it makes sense that the Hittites would be one of the types that the Egyptians depicted in the reliefs, and that this type would be depicted most frequently. I would suggest that the other 2 types also make sense. The Anatolians may have been a stereotypical representation of the cultures and ethnicities of Western Anatolia, while the Syrians may refer to all of the groups from Syria-Palestine who allied with the Hittites. However, the accuracy of these types appears to have been of little importance. They were stereotypical representations that visually represented all of the foreign countries against which Ramses fought. Indeed, it would seem that it was more important to show the large numbers of foreigners that the Egyptian pharaoh bravely faced. Interestingly, the number 3 symbolized plurality to the Egyptians, and it seems conceivable that they might have deliberately chosen to use specifically 3 types of foreigners for this reason. Moreover, there are always 3 men in each enemy chariot, unlike the Egyptian chariots that only have 2 men. Many scholars have accepted the historical accuracy of this detail. Not only do they cite the Kadesh reliefs, but the literary record, which claims that the Hittite king sent out abundant men in chariotry, quote, exceedingly numerous like the sand, they being 3 men to a chariot, end quote. These scholars explain away the Hittite chariots in a battle scene of Ramses' predecessor, Seti I, which only have 2 men in each, as simply demonstrating an abrupt change in Hittite military tactics. Although they continue to interpret the number of charioteers as historical, others have argued that the weaponry is not, and that the artists intentionally showed the Hittites armed only with defensive weapons, such as a lance, or none at all, for ideological reasons, rather than depicting the bows that the troops actually used. In contrast, Mario Liverani considered the 3 men to be ideological as well. Indeed, since there are 3 different ethnicities depicted here with these 3 men per chariot system, if truthful, the Kadesh material would suggest that during the reign of Ramses II, this was the usual practice throughout much of the ancient Near East, not only just for the Hittite military, but there is very little, if any, other evidence to support this. Instead, I agree with Liverani. It seems more likely that this feature does not reflect actual practices, but rather the prevalence of 3 men in each enemy chariot was another ideological detail, meant to further emphasize the multiplicity of the foreigners that Ramses single-handedly fought. In this way, the 3 men in each chariot echo the 3 types of foreigners. Similarly, the statement in the literary record would function in the same way, emphasizing the enormous number of enemies that Ramses was up against. The statement immediately before, which describes the chariotry as exceedingly numerous, like the sand, only further supports this reading. In this way, both the text and images then reinforce the multiplicity of the enemy coalition by listing many countries and using the number 3 repeatedly and in different ways. Together, they manipulate actuality when necessary to better reflect ideology. So returning to the ruler of Aleppo, this detail is included twice at the Ramesseum, where there are actually 2 separate Kadesh battle scenes, 1 carved on each temple pylon. The ruler of Aleppo is also partly preserved in the Abydos relief, though the accompanying caption is lost there. In the Ramesseum reliefs, the caption reads, quote, "The despicable ruler of Aleppo, he being emptied by his troops after his majesty had thrown him into the water." By not providing the ruler's actual name, as was done for many other lower-level enemies, the Egyptian artists have managed to point out the Aleppo ruler's status and role, while simultaneously stripping him of his full identity and individuality. In the imagery, his troops hold him upside down, with his arms hanging listlessly over his head at the river's edge. In one of the scenes at the Ramesseum, he is literally vomiting water from the Orontes. Kenneth Kitchen and others have noted the humor of the Aleppo king's depiction, a small detail within the much larger reliefs. However, at the same time, there may be graver and darker implications here. David O'Connor has observed that his upside-down pose equates the ruler of Aleppo with demonic beings of the netherworld. Indeed, in the New Kingdom books of the netherworld, the damned who failed the final judgment were thus recognized as enemies of Osiris and all of the gods. And they could be depicted and described as standing on their heads. This was a most severe punishment, through which they were forced to live off of their own excrement. They had no hope of revival or regeneration, and thus their upturned status was permanent and eternal. On the other hand, the 10th hour of the Amduat and the 9th hour of the Book of Gates depict drowned souls. Because they drowned, and their bodies were presumably lost to the current, they did not receive a proper burial. The water that their souls were now in was equated with the primeval waters of noon, and the drowned were in danger of vanishing into this, thus never reaching the beyond and becoming the blessed dead. Therefore, this death was certainly a fearful one. But several passages in the books of the netherworld show that the drowned, with the help of the gods, could be saved and reach the shores of the beyond directly from the primeval waters in which they floated. Furthermore, the Book of Gates demonstrates that all people, including foreigners, were present in the beyond. They were attended to and provided for, receiving their own place. Thus, the Hittites and other enemies of Ramses who are drowning in the Orontes suffer a terrible and fearful death. Yet they may still have a chance of making it to the beyond. While they are subjected to a horrific first death, their annihilation is not necessarily permanent. On the other hand, the ruler of Aleppo has been turned upside down. He is thus visually equated with the damned enemies of Osiris and the sun god, eternally standing on their heads. Just as vengeful demons hold the damned upside down in the Book of Earth, the Aleppo king's troops hold him upside down. In saving him from an earthly death, his troops have therefore symbolically sentenced him to a far worse fate. Now, the figure of Mu'attali II, the Hittite king and Ramses' primary foe, remains entirely or largely preserved in 4 of the Kadesh battle scenes. Those at Abu Simbel, the first pylon of the Ramesseum, Luxor, and Abydos. In each of these, there is a repetitive vignette that distinguishes Mu'attali. The king is always depicted inside his chariot, turning back towards Ramses with one arm lifted. He also wears a tight-fitting, long-sleeved dress, which is identical to that which the rest of the enemy troops wear. There is always one other individual inside this chariot, unlike the other enemy chariots with 3 men. This other man drives the king's chariot. A third man is also singled out from the other surrounding figures through his position. He stands on the ground behind the Hittite king and, except for at Abu Simbel, replicates the king's turned-back position. This man may be a shield bearer of Mu'attali, since he prominently carries a figure-8 shield and the hand closest to the king. And finally, there is a caption written in vertical columns placed above the Hittite king. Unfortunately, only part of this is preserved at Abydos. And in the 3 other reliefs, the caption varies somewhat, but its basic features remain the same. So just to give you one example, at Abu Simbel, the caption reads, "The despicable fallen ruler of Hatti, standing in the midst of his troops and chariotry, his face averted, shrinking away, his heart fainting. He could not come out to fight through fear of his majesty, when he saw his majesty conquering the forces of Hatti along with the chiefs," end quote. And with Hatti being the Egyptian name for the Hittites. This vignette is set on the opposite side of the Orontes from Ramses, behind Kadesh, and further surrounded by Hittite guards, probably because, as it is described both in the captions and the literary record, Mu'attali did not actually fight, but instead dispatched his troops. Except for the relief at Abu Simbel, where this is only described in the caption, large groups of infantrymen also always surround the Hittite king. In both the reliefs and the text, the Egyptian artist differentiated Mu'attali as an individual distinct from the horde of foreign enemies. For example, the Hittite king is typically larger than the rest of the figures in any relevant scene except Ramses himself. This size variance draws attention to Mu'attali as a ruler, albeit on a suitably modest scale, as he is much closer in size to all the other figures than to the enormous godlike Ramses. Additionally, in all of the captions and in the literary record and bulletin, the Hittite king is treated in a similar fashion as the ruler of Aleppo, in that he is never referred to by his actual name. Instead, he is repeatedly called the despicable ruler of Hatti, or the fallen one of Hatti. In this way, like the ruler of Aleppo, he is stripped of a specific identity and only afforded a generic one. Moreover, the helmet the Mu'attali wears at the Ramesseum and Abu Simbel appears to have tassels or some kind of adornment. This could also be indicative of his status, and thus perhaps a truthful detail. But it certainly visually sets the Hittite king further apart from the rest of the coalition. The fact that his chariot only has 2 people in it could be more truthful as well. On the other hand, one way that the Egyptian artist emphasized the ideologically negative aspects of Mu'attali was through his posture. In all 4 reliefs, the Hittite king's body faces away from Ramses, while his head is turned back, and his right or left arm is raised to the Egyptian pharaoh. This same posture is also visually reinforced elsewhere within the reliefs. At the Ramesseum, Luxor, and Abydos, the Hittite king's shield-bearer replicates a similar posture. And throughout all of the Kadesh scenes, in many of the enemy chariots, the third or rearmost positioned man is in the same turned-back position as well. The captions reinforce the larger imagery not only through what they say, but also through how they were written. Thus, at Luxor and Abu Simbel, the determinative for the word on, meaning to turn back, actually turns and outstretches his arms behind him. Overall, the Kadesh text strongly reinforced the turned-back position of the Hittite king that is depicted in the reliefs. Now, the most obvious meaning for this position would be that which is stated in the caption: the Hittite king turned back in fear. The direction of his body away from the battle and his raised arm also indicates his fear of and submission to Ramses. This interpretation could similarly be applied to all who exhibit it, including the shield-bearer and charioteers. However, there may also be a subtly implied alternate but complementary interpretation to this turned-back position that would serve to denigrate the Hittite king even further. In looking back towards the pharaoh, Mu'attali is retreating and literally turning his back to Ramses. The Egyptian verb hem means to retreat and turn one's back. However, Mokhtapa has noted that from its first attestation onwards, hem was used in opposition with cha'i, meaning male and man. Furthermore, Richard Parkinson has discussed how the word hem also had a sexual aspect. Indeed, hem, or back-turner, specifically characterized the passive role in a forced homosexual encounter. Parkinson concluded that according to Egyptian ideology, quote, the passive role was despised as a sign of physical weakness and of abandoning a man's proper gender role for a quote-unquote womanly one, end quote. O'Connor has suggested that demasculinization and feminization was one way in which the Egyptians metaphorically disarmed and subordinated the foreign enemies. Conversely, he noted that the adjectives generally used to describe the Egyptian pharaoh in battle tend to strongly enforce his virility and potency, highly masculine qualities. Consequently, the turned-back position of Mu'attali may be a reference to the verb or word, hem, and seems to allude to his highly negative, passive, and demasculinized role. But one could go even further and interpret it as almost a symbolic sexual invitation to Ramses. In this way, the position of the Hittite king metaphorically contrasts the tremendously positive and potent qualities of Ramses. The Hittite king's negative nature may also be highlighted, though in a different way, in a unique treatment of his body at Luxor. Unlike the other Hittites and their allies, here the Hittite king seems to be ostensibly and uniquely fat. His large belly extends forward, and both arms are thick and full. The Egyptian artist may have depicted this extra weight as an intentional slight. Rolls of fat and pendulent breasts were signs of wisdom, seniority, and status for Egyptian men in some contexts. However, these were not traits that a king would need on the battlefield. Instead, a king at battle should be represented as fit, active, and athletic, as the Egyptian artist depicted Ramses. Therefore, depicting a king or ruler while at battle with the heavy, overweight features that Mu'attali exhibits at Luxor may have been quite insulting and perhaps humorous. There might also be underlying irony to this representation, as here the Hittite king is not displaying wisdom and is naturally, in the eyes of the Egyptians, of a lowly status. While the Hittite king's turned back position and raised arm is repeated in all 4 reliefs, the position of his other arm and hand varies. At the Ramesseum, Luxor, and Abydos, he grasps a type of hand loop or rail on his chariot. Now, it does not really matter whether or not the representation of his chariot with such a support is accurate or truthful, though similar devices are attested on actual Egyptian chariots and in depictions of them. But rather the fact that the artist intentionally chose not only to include a hand loop on the Hittite king's chariot, but also to highlight it by depicting him grasping it, is meaningful. Even though it seems extremely unlikely that Ramses would ride into battle with the reins of his own chariot tied around his waist, he is rendered in this fashion to convey his immense capability and prowess. Rendering his chariot accurately was unimportant for the artist. Similarly, the Hittite king grasped the hand loop for ideological purposes. Once again, this particular detail serves to juxtapose Ramses and Mu'attali. Unlike Ramses, the inept Hittite king not only needs a driver, but he also requires a hand loop to steady himself while riding in his own chariot. On the other hand, at Abu Simbel, the Hittite king's left hand might grasp the reins of his horses. In this way, the Egyptians seem to have imparted a greater sense of urgency to his depiction. There is a tension and a heightened sense of his fear, perhaps to an almost humorous degree, which is emitted from this detail. And it seems to relate to the overall sense of the Hittite king's movement in each of the reliefs. In every case, the direction of this movement is away from the battle. For example, in sharp contrast to the inert mass of Hittite infantry, the wide-legged stance of the Hittite king's shield-bearer seems to indicate that he is running. Similarly, while Mu'attali glances back to Ramses, the chariot driver urgently leans forward, grasping the reins of the horses as if to focus solely on driving away. And at Abu Simbel, Mu'attali may be taking a more active role in assisting this objective. However, the stance of the Hittite king's horses differs from the wide and rear-legged gallop of Ramses' horses or the enemy horses who drive towards and surround the Egyptian pharaoh. Their positions seem to imply rapid movement. Instead, the Hittite king's horses appear to be only trotting. Unlike the reliefs, the texts do not imply that Mu'attali retreated. According to the literary record and the captions, Mu'attali was never on the battlefield, but remained in his original position behind the city of Kadesh, and thus he would have had no reason to retreat unless Ramses succeeded in taking Kadesh, which he never did. Additionally, the literary record describes the Hittite king's surrender at the end of the second day of fighting. Therefore, he must not have left the vicinity of the battle. Instead, his fleeing within the reliefs should be seen as another example of the artist's deliberate manipulation of the imagery to convey ideology. By fleeing from the battle, Mu'attali simultaneously admits his fear, cowardliness, defeat, and submission. Interestingly, there does seem to be a discrepancy between the urgency of Mu'attali, the shield bearer, and the chariot driver, and the more casual movement of the horses. This may be another subtle mockery of the Hittite king. He wants to flee, but his horses are either incapable or just unconcerned with meeting his desire. Ramses II actually fought an important battle at Kadesh, yet in many, many ways, his representations of this event are far from mimetic and historically accurate, but instead integrate ideologically charged topos. Regarding the depiction of the Hittite coalition, there was an effort to emphasize their multiplicity in different ways. In the reliefs, only 3 foreign types were depicted, while in the text, the Egyptians actually listed the many foreign countries that fought with the Hittites. In this case, the text would then seem to be more reflective of reality, but in both text and imagery, the stress on 3 men inside each chariot was likely ideological. The ruler of Aleppo was allied with the Hittites and appears to have actually been on the battlefield. But visually, he is turned upside down, symbolically transforming him into a damned soul, eternally tortured in the netherworld. Similarly, it was essential that the Hittite king be identifiable as such, namely a foreigner of higher status and power. But the Egyptian artist also needed to make his ideologically rebellious and malignant nature clear. Thus, through markers such as variations in scale and an identifying caption, the viewer recognizes Mu'attali as a special and distinct foreigner. However, the artist also successfully managed to highlight the Hittite king's highly negative, passive, and inferior position with other details, such as his turned-back position, his unflattering, hefty portrayal at Luxor, and the variations in the position of his lowered hand. The Kadesh reliefs are massive, and it can be easy to overlook these essentially tiny details within them. But through a careful study of their individual components, it is possible to gain a better understanding of how the Egyptians balanced actuality and ideology in order to convey the sense that at Kadesh, Ramses II took on and defeated the entire ancient world. Thank you.
You discussed the fact that there are three figures and there was a multiplicity of countries, ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Do you think the three represent anything significant in terms of the population that was against Ramses? Were they the three leading countries, or were these just represented?
So I think I very briefly said that I think that they could be kind of stereotypical representations of ethnic groups that kind of covered regions that the coalition was from. So you have the Hittites, and that obviously makes a lot of sense. And then the other two would be the Syrians, which are more of the southern group, and that I think would kind of quickly be a stereotypical representation for all of those groups from the Levant and Syria, Palestine that were part of this coalition. And then these Anatolians were probably, or as far as I can tell, probably Western Anatolian kind of stereotypical groups. So then you have, the Hittites, which are more central, kind of Eastern Anatolia, the West, and then the South. And this kind of, it doesn't really fully match up, but I think it was enough. It's that would be that's my best kind of assignment. But I don't think it really mattered that much to the Egyptians. There are just three different types of that did it. Yeah.
I really appreciated how you were able to kind of highlight these details and kind of, figuring out the Egyptians' kind of visual arguments in these scenes. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the transformation of the Hittite king into the, these damned figures, because they're, at least the examples you showed in your images are from a little bit later, right? So they're from like KV9 or.
Yeah. So the Aleppo, the king from Aleppo, not the
Aleppo king. And I was wondering if then we can think of these artists as perhaps having access to these visual iconography that appear later. I mean, I don't know.
Well, they're not all. Well,
they're not
yeah. I mean,
all
the examples I showed, but you generally have these within the royal tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs. I never thought of that actually. I don't think I'd go so far as to say anything direct like that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it was probably more of a general kind of knowledge. I have to think about that. That's a really interesting question. Definitely, I would definitely not go so far as to say direct.
Okay.
And did you?
I just said, Catherine said that Setting the First already has the foreigners.
Yeah, no, the foreigners are in, and I think the ideas would have definitely been circulating in this kind of religion to this degree within the afterworld religion for the king, the royal kings of the New Kingdom, for the kings of the New Kingdom. But I would not say there's anything direct. I think it was more kind of general knowledge. How that information got transferred. That's something else. But because the material is so repetitive to some degree, I mean, to some degree you have, it's interesting, this is a whole other kind of question with these reliefs, is how the artists were, did you have, were there copybooks, were there artists moving between all of these temples, how were these reliefs being made, and do you have similar groups of artists? So that might come into play there with how the communication between artists working in the royal tombs and these artists who are working at temples. But that's a huge issue.
Since these are massive,
Yeah.
the details you're showing would have been comparatively small,
Mhm.
but painted.
Yes.
Who could really
See them.
see them,
Mhm.
have this knowledge,
Mhm.
have the time to scrutinize it?
Mhm.
How high up would those images that you were showing have
Yeah.
been to
So-
the person standing there?
Here, I guess you can't see in this image. Here, they're about kind of halfway up the pylon. Oh, actually, you can't here. I can see it right here. You can see, if you can kind of make out that's Ramses' horse.
You see the people down there.
And you can see the people down here. So I mean, these are high. These are high. It depends on the temple, because in this case they're high, but they're on the pylon, so they're kind of in front, but they're very high. At Abydos, they're on the outer walls, and they're actually quite low around the outer walls. So it would depend from temple to temple in terms of kind of visibility, but the question of audience is a really important kind of point to keep in mind. To some degree, and this is, I should also say, this is a question that I myself kind of think about a lot and kind of don't really have necessarily a final answer on that. I think one of the most important audiences was simply the gods. And it didn't even necessarily matter who was seeing them because it was there. It was partly just putting that there. At the same time, these are, actually this is a good example because this representation is unique. I'm sure many of you know, usually on the front of pylons during the New Kingdom, you have smiting scenes. This is the only pylon, yeah, I'm pretty sure, so somebody stop me if I'm wrong. But this is the only pylon that I can think of right now, and I'm pretty sure the only pylon that doesn't have the outer face of it, and where you have this battle scene. So the smiting scene is such a kind of ideologically charged, stereotypical scene, and here you can see Ramses at least felt he had, it was okay to replace it with this battle scene. So it gives you a sense of that these scenes were partly just there for the meaning, for the impact, for the ideological kind of implications of them, the protected nature of them. At the same time, they would have been painted, and the ones on the outer walls, they would have been more visible. So,
I mean, you showed the one on topmost third at the beginning.
yeah,
That's very visible.
exactly.
Easily for
Exactly.
someone like a billboard right
Exactly.
in Times Square. Look at
Right.
it right away.
And when you think
It's
about
not cluttered the same way
Right.
these are.
And when you think about them being painted, it suddenly becomes like the next time anyone's at the Ramesseum, you can still see the second pylon Kadesh battle. I wanted to sneak it in here, but there is still some painted traces on that one. And even with the little bit that's there, it's amazing how much more visible it suddenly becomes. So when you think about originally when these were done, they would, I mean, I don't know if anyone would have sat there and like tried to zoom in on the ruler of Aleppo, but they would have been far more visible than what we see today. So I think it was kind of, I think there were multiple audiences in mind.
Tara, are there any traces of additional Kadesh scenes elsewhere?
You mean outside of Egypt?
No, I mean apart from the 4 that survive largely intact.
No, so there's traces at the 5 temples, the 3 Theban, the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, Luxor temple, Karnak temple, then Abydos, his temple at Abydos, and the great temple at Abu Simbel are where we have Kadesh reliefs and parts of poems and the bulletin. Those are the only temples, but like I think I just quickly said, there are, at some places it's repeated. So at the Ramesseum, he actually repeats the battle scene twice. So, I mean, there's nothing else like that, where you have a king repeating the same battle scene multiple times. I mean, it's interesting to think about why. But you do, I should say that there are, the literary record that I mentioned, that we do have 3 fragmentary papyri with that as well. So this would have, that at least the story was disseminated more widely. Even more widely than at all of the temples.
Would all of the battle scenes have been visible to the populace based on where they were placed?
All of the Kadesh battle scenes?
Yeah.
Not in general. Like, for instance, the second pylon Ramesseum, you would have had to get into, I mean, well, actually, even the first pylon's on the back of the pylon, so you'd have to be in that first court. Then the second pylon, you would have to be in the second, it's on the back of the second pylon, so you'd have to be into the second court. So, not necessarily, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't have been visible to nobody.
But it's not as propagandistic as people have sometimes
It's
said.
definitely propagandistic, but the extent to which, again, the visibility varies from time to time.
This seems like a stretch, but maybe not. I kept on thinking about the myth of the Magi and the whole, there's 3 kings and they're different parts of the world that they come from. It's a very similar, and it seems to be a kind of way of depicting, as the foreigners here, depicting symbolic. People kind of supports your thesis, and it supports the thesis that the Magi are more symbolic than specific.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak too much to the Magi themselves, but it is very common within Egyptian art in regard to foreigners. It's not across the board at all. You have all sorts of other variations, and I should say, even within the Kadesh scenes, there are other foreigners depicted, but they're rare. You really have to hunt through them, and to some degree, it's almost, except for in one case, which is actually at Luxor. Try to quickly, Luxor here. Yeah, so if you look up here at the men who are shown inside the city itself, the city walls, protecting the city, if you look carefully at them, they are different ethnicities. So there are some other ones thrown in, and then sometimes if you really hunt through the kind of mass of all the dying and defeated, once in a while you find somebody who is not one of the 3 types I mentioned, which makes you think like, oh, maybe an artist got bored and was like, all right, I'm going to do somebody different for a change. But the kind of tendency to do the stereotypicalness is not unusual at all for foreign representation.
Another aspect of just depiction itself that supports the idea that it's ideological is just how stylized and geometric some of it is.
Yeah.
It kind of takes it out into realism.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to, I'm always, battle scenes are interesting because there's sometimes a tendency to really want to use them as historical documents. I mean, because, we want to. But it's risky because then you really can start to dig under and realize there's a lot of ideological stuff going on here. That doesn't by any means mean that it's all ideological, but it means you have to be really careful when we're kind of trying to use them to form histories.
And with the idea that it's stylized in some places, in other places it's really messy. I mean,
Yeah.
is that...
That's definitely, that's again another feature of battle scenes in general. There's this, and it's this kind of, the disorder of it in contrast to the ordered Egyptian world. The kind of pharaoh is always shown as distinct. I mean, it's very clear here. The pharaoh is always distinct, and he has his space, and then you have this mass of intertwined, kind of dying, dead, foreign foes, and that is very much characteristic of battle scenes in general, not just Kadesh, all battle scenes.
Not really related to the depiction of foreigners, but why the heck is the first scene showing him finding out he's been betrayed? Do you have any ideas about that? Seems a very strange place.
Kadesh is so
I
cool
always thought it
because
was
it's
receiving
like,
a surrender.
I know, it's like the whole thing, like why does he love this story so much? I don't know. It's to some degree I feel like it's like the ultimate foil. You know, he's like, oh, he's betrayed, but then, you know, he comes back and he strikes back with a vengeance. Why he shows himself tricked, you also have the human nature of the king. It shows him, you know, I wouldn't say the fallibility because he obviously comes back, but in the textual records as well, he literally cries out to Amun. You have this moment where he himself kind of admits that, like, I'm in the thick of things, and he says, you know, I cried out to Amun, and my father was there with me immediately, and he helped me through this. So there is some kind of humanizing element going on here as well, I think. But it's kind of weird that he would show himself like, it's one thing, you know, calling to the god, it's another thing admitting that he was tricked. So yeah, I don't know.
And couldn't that emphasize his, I'm thinking here off the cuff, but what you said made me think that maybe he's emphasizing his human aspect in the first scene, and then he's divinizing himself later
No,
on.
I think it could be part of this kind of humanistic side of the game. I don't think that's the only. I think there could be a lot of reasons for it. But it's unusual when it comes to kind of, I mean, everything about, not everything, but almost everything about the Kadesh scene is material is kind of unusual to some degree. But it's one of the kind of really unusual things about it.
Last question here.
Didn't mean to keep you from the food.
We have a reception out here, folks.
The Egyptian troops returning from the battle, they would have had their own story to tell.
I know, yeah.
Their family,
Yeah.
their friends, the community.
Yeah.
And it would have been very different.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been this clean victory. They knew it was a tie.
Yeah. I mean,
They knew
everybody-
Ramses hadn't really won.
Yeah.
And they're telling that story back in the
Yeah.
capital. And that's spreading around the military establishment, diplomatic. So Ramsey would have had to deal with that reality as well.
In some degree, in some ways, it's almost like the ultimate spin story, you know? Kind of like, all right, I gotta, you know. And then we also have to keep in mind, this happened very early in his reign. This was his fifth regnal year. So, you know, that might come into play with kind of the purpose and even his own intentions with the kind of dispersal of the material as well. But it is really, I like that.
Thank you.